The ninth commandment, the heart of self-control. Jimmy Carter, one of our great devout Baptists in this country, and then President of the United States, remember, admitted to a reporter once that yes, there had been times in his life when he had looked with interest at women other than his wife. He had, he said, if you remember, lusted after them in his heart. The gasps from people who were horrified to hear such a thing from a man of Carter's personal integrity and public stature were heard all over the country. You thought that the earth shook when that poor man said his truth. Some people even said the comment had a part to play in his failure to be elected to his second term as president. Well, not where I come from, honey. Where I came from, people laughed at the whole thing. Oh, come now, those people said. And they brushed the issue off. What is your problem? They wanted to know. And that's a very important question. What is the problem? The truth is that to many, the 9th and 10th commandments, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods, seem to be totally without value, even without substance. How can something have any moral importance as long as we won't do anything more immoral in the process of thinking about getting it? It's that kind of legalism that may indicate less how pious we are and more how really underdeveloped we are in our spirituality. Before we can answer that question, there are two other things, however, that we need to understand. First, some groups count the commandments differently than other groups do. All of them Christians, but they define the order of commandments distinctly. For instance, Jewish law and most of mainline Protestantism treat as one commandment what Catholics and Lutherans call the 9th and 10th commandments. Also, the Jewish tradition treats, I am the Lord your God, you shall not have other gods beside me, as two distinct commandments, rather than as one commandment, as Lutherans and Catholics and many other Christian denominations do. In this case, Judaism teaches, I am the Lord your God is the recognition of the monotheistic nature of God. You've got to know there is one God. The second part of that is their second commandment. You shall not have other gods beside me. The Jewish tradition interprets this as a distinct and separate prescription against the making of material images of God, and they don't. And as I said in an earlier discussion, nor did Christians until after the 6th century, and they discovered that they needed images to catechize an illiterate population. So none of the ideas are lost anyplace, but the ordering does. Therefore, when you get to this 9th and 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, people will stop and say, I don't think there's anything different. Is this just the 6th commandment done over again? Well, whatever that the emphasis that comes out of the interpretation of that language, and however people explain it is almost irrelevant. We really don't care. What we're looking for, in other words, is what is it about? What's it saying to us? Whatever the situation, as a result of this difference of translation or emphasis, it was necessary for Catholics and Lutherans now to present the single prescription against covetousness as two separate items, as 9th and 10th commandments, in order to have 10 distinct commandments. No ideas are lost, no ideas are created, there's nothing added. It's simply a presentation of these ideas. It is covetousness, disordered desire of any kind, they say, not simply sex, that is the problem in the 9th commandment. It is failing to rein in our tendencies and inclinations, our hungers and our thirsts that this commandment is really about. It's not a replay of the 6th commandment. And I think there is real wisdom to that interpretation. After all, it is precisely this dearth of moral fortitude, this lack of real intent to put limits on any of our appetites that leads to eternal restlessness of the soul. If there are no boundaries to your wants, there is no contentment in your life. It can't be achieved. It is, after all, more the refusal to be satisfied with what we have than an awareness of what we don't have that undermines our happiness in life. Covetousness, this interpretation says, is the spiritual disease of unbridled desire. It's a need for constant satisfaction of the senses. The inability to be at peace with the self and with life is the sin that leads to perpetual personal discontent. If you want to know how to be unhappy, ignore this commandment. We spend life pressing to get what we want any way we can. And this culture, you see, encourages that, requires that, and competition and comparison are its fuels. You got to have a car like their car. You got to have a house as big as their house. Competition for things pits us against the rest of the world. There's always someone out there who has more than I do. So get it, and don't accept less, because having it is the sign of your own internal value. But with that attitude, whatever I see that I want begins to burrow a hole down in the center of the soul, and it makes it impossible for me to see what I do have. As a result, everyone I meet is my potential enemy. What's she got? How much money does he have? Where have they been? They have more or less than we do. My brother-in-law does better than my husband. If he would work a little harder, we could make it. Everybody's a possible competitor rather than a possible ally. I begin to compare myself to everyone around me. I spend my life trying to catch up with everybody else. So what is the word to which the 9th commandment calls us? The word is control. As a little less than the angels, we have the ability to do what the rest of the cosmos cannot. We have been given the ability to control ourselves. It is an unbridled lack of control that leads to sin. The power to choose for more than things, for more than satiation, is the glory of God in us. And when we can control that great need for everything around us, then we find out what's in us, and we begin to know what the glory of being alive and the glory of the presence of God in my life is really about. But we live now, you and I, in a culture that runs on satiation. It's going to be very difficult for you to get away from it. We're told constantly what we must have to be noticed, what we must buy to be up to date, what we must wear to be successful, what we must do if we want to be seen as sophisticated, as successful, as socially sensational. But the 9th commandment tells us we don't have to do any of those things. It tells us not to feed the beasts of desire and accumulation, not to give them the ownership of our souls, not to let them drive us out of our minds, mad with wanting someone else's house, someone else's car, someone else's job, someone else's club memberships. It calls us to recognize, like Jimmy Carter, that yes, we do know lust in our hearts, but we have also learned how to say no to it. Lust becomes the attempt to consume everything we see. But lust also means that what we see, if we're not careful, will end up consuming us. More sex, more money, more porn, more bling, more stuff, more junk, more things to talk about and lie about and fail ever to really enjoy. When we want what is not ours, it will possess us more than we will ever be able to possess it. As George Bernard Shaw put it, there are two great tragedies in life. One is not to get your heart's desire. The other is to get it. John Layer, the American critic, said, "Society drives people crazy with lust and calls it advertising." Until someday we finally learn what we wouldn't allow the commandments to teach us. It isn't what we have that makes us unhappy. It's what we want that leaves us dull to the present and totally unaware of all the good we have already been given. Say hallelujah for it.
Okay, so she puts a new spin on that. But one of the things that I think I need to say at the outset, and questions that were asked right at the beginning, was the understanding of the division of how the 10 Commandments are in fact compiled. Sometimes we see the Jewish version, sometimes we see the later version where the 9 and 10 are one commandment. So I'm glad that she clarified that for us. In her book, however, things that she hasn't covered, and I thought I would share this with you. And this will take us back to the sixth commandment a bit. And so she writes, the problem is that most people miss the meaning of the ninth commandment entirely. They fail to realize that the very phrasing of the ninth commandment is a lesson in culture, in history, in society, in human relations, as well as in ongoing moral development. This commandment, more than most, indicates how even our understanding of the moral life changes with time. And so she goes on to say the original statement of the ninth commandment, for instance, reads, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife," period. Wife. Not thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's husband. Not thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's spouse. This commandment, in its original intent, only deals with the injustice of one man taking another man's property. The commandment is about male property rights. It is not really about sanctity, the power, the inviolability of the marital relationship. In those days, women, like land and animals, belonged to men. Fathers gave their daughters away to another man in marriage. Mothers did not give their sons away to another woman. Men did not belong to women, nor could women own anything at all. They had no property rights, no financial independence, no legal identity, no rights before the court. For centuries, men could, and usually did, have multiple wives. Women, on the other hand, were allowed only to have only one husband. The situation is very clear about who owned who. In some parts of the world, to this day, the situation has yet to change. But at least for some parts of the world, we have come to translate this statement to mean something very different. To talk about what it means to destroy the bonds that make a pair a couple, a relationship, a home. The problem is that in the broadening of the interpretation, important as it is, good as it is, significant as it is, we are at the point that we now risk misunderstanding another undercurrent of this commandment that may be more important than ever to our society. This commandment is about lust, about the insatiable need not simply to have more than we need, but to have more than is good for us. This commandment is about the degradation that comes with trying to suck all the air out of life, and so failing to be satisfied with anything. She mentioned some of this in her talk. Lust is an attempt to consume everything we see. It also means that what we see consumes us as well. The exploitation of women and men is lust. The division of people into types, some expendable, some not, is lust. The hiring of women at lesser pay than men to do the same job the man does is lust. The downsizing of an older man just before his pension comes due is lust. The hiring of younger people rather than experienced people so that we can get their energy without paying for their experience is lust. Thou shalt not covet the body of thy neighbor's spouse is a commandment we could all stand to visit again in this lustful age of ours. And so she writes some things for us. She says, when men are really men, women don't need to be protected. We want what we want. What is not ours, we want it all in the end, and it will possess us more than we possess it. When we pursue a person for the physical release they promise us, rather than for the spiritual growth they require of us, we have sold our souls to the quest of the unreal and the totally temporary. And then she ends off this chapter saying the Buddha taught that just as a tree, though cut down, can grow again and again if its roots are undamaged and strong. In the same way, if the roots of craving are not wholly uprooted, sorrows will come again and again. It isn't what we have that makes us unhappy. It's what we want that leaves us dull to the present and unaware of what we have. So she's given in her book, she gives a lot more than is actually presented in that talk. And I thought it would be good just to share that with you. So let's look at the 10th one.
Now we're going to talk about that second law of covetousness, the 10th commandment, the heart of assurance, I think. It's almost impossible, however, for me to consider the meaning of the commandments for our times, especially these, without thinking again of the first and most ancient story I ever heard that helped me make sense of the impact of this last item in the Decalogue. It's an old monastic story that we tell one another hundreds of years over, from the tales of the desert monastics that have been being told since the 3rd century. This story goes like this. Once upon a time, a disciple went to visit an old monastic who was said to have an unusually compassionate heart and deep, deep wisdom. But when he got to the monastery, where he expected to find this grand and glorious elder, he was totally startled by the emptiness of the place. There were a number of people waiting to see the Holy One, but there were no great shrines. There were no dazzling statues. There were no larger-than-life altars or candlesticks or icons or pulpits. There was almost nothing in the little room where the old monastic lived. The cell of the Holy One was, in fact, particularly sparse. Just a desk and a cot, a Bible and a basin, some papers and a pen. Visitor looked around the place, and a furrow etched his brow. What kind of a famous scholar was this. Is this all you have? He said, looking around the room in great dismay. Well, the elder said, what do you have? Well, I don't have anything, the seeker said, but why would I? I am not from here. I am only passing through. I know, the old monastic said, so am I. Then I understood the importance of this 10th commandment. Nevertheless, you shall not crave things. Hardly seems, doesn't it, like a final chord proper to the Decalogue. Is this paltry little observation the peak of spirituality? The great spiritual insight toward which all the other commandments point? Oh, surely not. Surely the apex to the 10 great words that make for human community should be more glorious than this. Beware the inability to think beyond the obvious. The scholars have argued for generations about whether or not the commandments are more action-centered or idea-centered, more concerned with ethical behavior or with the development of right attitudes. After all the other commandments specify particular behaviors. Accept the one God. Don't blame God for your situation. Worship God. Care for your elders. Preserve life. Love faithfully. Tell the truth. Do not steal. Control your senses. Control your ideas. Since 9 and 10 are not about specific actions, why are they here? The answer emerges in every ancient spiritual tradition. There is none without this. Spiritual masters in every generation of every people teach that only God is everything. Only God is what life is really all about. Only God is what's worth having even here. We must learn to see beyond all things, to hold them in a very relaxed grasp in order to discover the one from whom all of them take their being. To the Hindu, this process of detachment from things is made plain in the sannyasi, the one who, after years of striving to survive, to succeed, to secure the good life for himself and his family, finally comes to the point of life where he simply leaves all things to seek God, the only thing worth having. In Buddhism, the purpose of life is to achieve desirelessness, to grow beyond the need to accumulate or to control, to the point where nothing in life can irritate the soul or consume the passions or capture the mind to the point of heartbreak. In Islam, it is the witness of the Sufi that there is a point in life at which the person is so centered in the presence of God that creature and creator can come to one mind and one heart, even here and now. In Israel, the realization is that the awareness of the one God is everything, is enough, is the magnet that pulls us beyond the confines of this life and immerses us in faith enough for the next. It's this awareness itself that life is really about, Judaism says. And in Christianity, it is following Jesus that separates us from devotion to the self, from the purely material aspects of life, so that we can come to know the mystical aspects of life that is the bridge between this life and the next. It's that moment of genuine freedom of soul that is the core of the spiritual life. We suddenly realize that we have grown beyond the search for a magical God who does tricks for us by changing life as it is to life as we want it to be on Wednesday morning. And then we'll change it again for us on Thursday morning. We find our way through the temples we have built to ourselves to discover the temple that is the origin of the self. We learn to care for those who before us have enabled us to grow in their wisdom. We begin to value and protect the lives of others rather than center on ourselves alone. We come to reverence intimacy rather than denigrate sex. We refuse to enrich ourselves by impoverishing another. We learn to use truth to engage life and enlighten the world rather than scam it. And then, when all of that is finished, we see that we are finally ready to put down our own attachments, our narcissism, the false God that is ourself, and find that we are now in the midst of building the new community, the people of God, because we're free now. Our compulsions have evaporated now. We're healthy in mind now. We are free of the need to compete. We do not need to inflate ourselves now with bigger, faster, finer, larger, more expensive things in order to convince ourselves, let alone anyone else, of our importance. We can simply let go now of our grasping, clinging ways. We can be simply ourselves now, full of life, steeped in peace, and at home in the God who made us to be one. Then shalom finally comes. We're at peace with ourselves now. We're content with our neighbors. We're in love with our God who is beyond things, and everything there is worth having at the same time. The essence of the 9th and 10th commandment, then, is the total embodiment of the first commandment. It's the putting away of idols. It's the melting into God. May your journey into God begin and end by letting go of anything lesser on the way that obstructs your vision of the end, even here, even now.
So right at the end, I know which light to switch on. She writes in her book, perhaps one of the greatest philanthropists of modern times, John D. Rockefeller, understood the difference between greed and gain best. He said, I know of nothing more despicable and pathetic than a person who devotes all the hours of the waking day to making money for money's sake. It's not wealth, in other words, that is in question. It is why we make it and what we do with it when we have it that makes the difference. The compulsive need to amass things may be nothing more than a signal of the emptiness of our souls. To work hard, to play well, to enjoy life, to give to others, and to be satisfied with what we have may be the only criteria we need to know whether or not we have really succeeded in life. And so she goes on to write, in this culture, a sense of enoughness is a sign of mental aberration. A need for moreness is considered normal. What a pathetic way to go through life, always grasping, always greedy, always discontented with the self. Greed can lead to jealousy, which means that I not only never get enough of the things I want, but the more I see, the more friends I lose. Whenever a friend succeeds, a little something in me dies. Truly pitiable. To cure greed, we must learn to love something enough to be willing to do without everything else but it. If you want to break the tendency to greed, when you get something new, unless you go on using the first one as well as the second, try giving the old one away. If you find yourself simply storing it, beware. Beware of what you value in your life. You get exactly what you're looking for without any of the cure for it. Or as Imelda Marcos said once with great indignation, I did not have 3,000 pairs of shoes, I had 1,060. So Joan writes, I know that Imelda Marcos had at least 1,000 pair of shoes because I saw them with my own eyes. But all I could think of when I looked at them was that if she wore one pair a day, every day of the year, each pair would be worn on average no more than once every 3 years. Outside the palace, though, children walked through the streets wearing no shoes at all. That's not a hobby, that's greed. The question I knew was, what is it in my life that is the equivalent of Imelda Marcos' shoes? And Joan continues, greed eats away at the soul, distracts us from friendship, consumes us with want. There is, the Buddha says, no fire like passion. There is no shark like hatred. There is no snare like folly. And there is no torrent like greed. It isn't that greed is a sin against others, that it is its only evil. It is that greed is self-destructive, that makes it so pathetic. Greed eats out the center of our own lives. We exhaust ourselves with envy instead of learning to enjoy what we already have. And then she ends off her chapter saying, give one thing away every day for a month. It's called oiling the soul so it works better. I like what she wrote about Christianity when she compared all the different faiths. She says in Christianity, the mystical tradition developed what the Decalogue implies. If you put down your desires for everything other than God, the mystics teach, you will find God. Beyond accumulation and possessiveness, the one to whom the entire Decalogue points will take hold of you and capture you completely. So much truth in what she has written. And now you have a chance to share some of your own reflections on the questions that have been prepared. I think if you're enough to form one group,